So we're going to be on Mem Bet. It's the top of the page, sort of a few lines down. Let's see how many lines. I would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. About 10 lines down where the two dots are. Because we said in the Mishnah that a person, we dealt with the issue of taking the pot or taking the hot urn off of the stove, and then the problem of putting water into it. And we talked yesterday about whether the case of the Mishnah is referring to a case in which the water is removed from the pot, or it's talking about a case in which there is water in the pot. Either way, in the conclusion of that Mishnah, we said, but you can put water into a cup or into a pot of water if the purpose is not to heat the water, not to cook water, but is merely to take the chill off of the water, to warm it, to make it lukewarm. So Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Noten Adam Chamin letoch hatzonen, v'lo hatzonen letoch hachamin, divrei Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai says that even in a cup, okay, even if we're dealing in a cup, one can put hot water into cold water, because all that will do is cool the water. But velo atzonen letoch hachamin, but he cannot put cold water into hot water, because if he puts cold water into hot water, the hot water is, we have a principle of tata'e gavar, which means that whatever's underneath is going to be the tata'ah, the underneath part is going to heat the top part, whatever comes from the top, and so therefore we view it as if you're putting cold water into hot water. You're basically cooking the water. Okay, you're cooking the cold water. That's what Beit Shammai says. This is a principle in kashrut as well. The difference between what's underneath and what's coming from the top, in terms of what is considered to be the active part of a mixture. So when what is coming from the top, in other words, if a hot piece of chicken falls into a cold milk, as opposed to a cold piece of chicken falling into a hot dairy soup, there's different halachot depending on which direction it goes. So similarly, and it's the principle is tata'ah gavar, the bottom is the one that rules. So here it's considered like a mixture of cooking because the bottom is the hot part. That's what Beit Shammai says. However, Beit Hillel omrim ben chamin letoch hatzonen or ben tzonen letoch hachamin mutar, that you can put hot water into cold water and cold water into hot water. But bamed dvarim amurim, when is this speaking? Bakos aval bambati chamin letoch hatzonen velo tzonen letoch hachamin. So basically, this is talking about a cup. In other words, we're not talking about what's called a kli rishon. Kli rishon is a pot that was over the fire. A pot that was over the fire, for sure, you can't put cold water into it. There's no question. But if we're dealing with a cup of water, in other words, you have removed you have an urn. The urn is considered, you have a teapot. The teapot is called kli rishon because it was actually over the fire. Even after you've taken it off of the fire, it's still called kli rishon. It's still called a primary vessel. Now you take that primary vessel and you pour it into a mug, like this, for example. It's a perfect example of a kli sheni, because I took it right from the kli rishon. This is kli sheni. So now that I have a kli sheni, so this is what we're talking about. Beit Hillel says you can put cold water into this on Shabbat. And if this were a cold cup instead of a hot cup, I could also take hot water and put it into here. Because in a kli sheni, we're not concerned about any cooking taking place. Beit Shammai is saying, even in a kli sheni, we're going to be strict and say that you cannot pour cold water into hot water, because it's like cooking. So even though on a biblical level perhaps it isn't cooking, because it's not a kli rishon, and a kli sheni, we say kli sheni eno mevashel, that a second vessel can't really effectuate cooking. Well, nobody would say, we want to cook something, let's put it in my mug of coffee. That's not going to work very well. But Beit Shammai is stringent and says, since it's similar to cooking, don't do it. Now, however, bambati, but in a bath, in other words, in a bathtub, and in those days the bathtub would be very, very hot, and could even be a kli rishon. Actually, could even be heated directly over the fire to warm it up before somebody. Obviously, you wouldn't go in there while it was over the fire, because then you would get burnt. But the water might even be a kli rishon, because you might heat the bath over the fire and then take it away from the fire, of course, before you go inside, and maybe cool it off with a little cold water. We take for granted how easy it is to turn one knob for hot and one knob for cold. They didn't have that, so they had to mix, some actually hot water with some cold water to get the right temperature. So in that case, even Beit Hillel is going to agree that we're not going to put cold water into hot water because it's similar to cooking, or it is cooking. If it's actually a Kli Rishon, it would actually be cooking in that case to put the cold water into the hot water if that bathtub was actually placed directly over a fire to heat it originally. So that's why he says, Chamin l'toch hatzonein v'lo tzonein l'toch chamin. In other words, if you have a cold bath and you pour some hot water into it, that would be okay. But if you had a hot bath that's such a high temperature and you poured cold water into it, it would be a problem. Because even though this particular bathtub might not be a Kli Rishon, and we can assume maybe perhaps that it isn't, but still, since there are cases in which one might heat the water in that way, we're concerned that a person shouldn't put the cold water into the hot water in a bathtub type of situation. Now, for Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya Oser, Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya prohibits. Okay, the Gemara is going to struggle with what is he prohibiting, which case, what is he talking about. So rather than making an ideological commitment at this point, let's see how the Gemara is going to work it out. Now, Amar Rav Nachman, and just to make things worse for a moment, Halacha Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, that Rav Nachman says the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya that we have no idea what he said. So that makes it a little bit more difficult, but we'll find out what he said in a second. So, Savar Rav Yosef lememar sefel haru kambati, that originally Rav Yosef thought that a sefel, a wash basin, okay, which is definitely a secondary vessel, because it's like a wash basin, you take from an actual pot of water, let's say, and you pour it into this wash basin, which now you're going to use to wash your face and hands. He thought that should be the same as ambati. And just like ambati, Beit Hillel said, you cannot pour you cannot pour any water. You can't pour cold water into the hot bathtub. So you wouldn't be able to pour cold water into this hot wash basin. In other words, if you have a wash basin that you took the hot water, even though it's definitely a kli sheni, it's a secondary vessel. You wouldn't put a wash basin directly over the fire. Now we're assuming here, the assumption of the Gemara is that Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya was saying that you can't put anything in a bathtub. In other words, he was prohibiting in the last case where Beit Hillel said that you could put warm water, but you can't put cold water. He said, no, you can't put anything in a bathtub. You can't put cold water into hot. You can't put hot water into a cold bathtub. In a bathtub, you can't do anything. Okay? And Rav Yosef is coming along and saying a wash basin is the same as a bathtub. What would that mean? You can't put anything. In other words, you got to take the water as it is. If it's scalding hot, that's what you're washing with. If it's freezing cold, that's what you're washing with. That's it. So, Amar le Abaye said to him, Tanei Rabbi Chia, Sefel eno kembati. Rabbi Chia said, you're wrong. That a sefel, a wash basin, is not considered like a bathtub. A bathtub is either a Kli Rishon itself, or it's so hot that it's similar to a Kli Rishon. But a sefel, a wash basin, is not a Kli Rishon at all. It's certainly not a primary vessel. It's not a vessel that's heated over the fire, and therefore Rabbi Chia said that you could put cold water into it to cool it if the water is too hot. So the problem is, though, what was Rav Yosef thinking? Because after all, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, you can't put any cold water into a bathtub and you can't put hot water into a bathtub. You have to leave the bathtub as it is. If it's cold, it's cold. If it's hot, it's hot. That's it. And he's telling us that a wash basin is the same as a bathtub. And we said that Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya says that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya. And Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya says you can't do anything with a bathtub. That means you can't adjust the temperature of a wash basin. But that means you can never wash with hot water in a wash basin. Because after all, you're not going to take that scalding hot water and put it on your face. So that would mean you could only use cold water to wash on Shabbat. And we've never heard such a concept that you can't use hot water to at least wash your face, feet, and hands on Shabbat. That should certainly be allowed. So what was he thinking to say that a wash basin should be like a bathtub, when that would lead us to the absurd conclusion that one can never have a wash basin with warm water in it on Shabbat, because it would be impossible to moderate the temperature in any way. So what was he thinking? He was thinking this: because you're assuming that Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya was commenting on the last case, and he was saying that you can't put cold water into a hot bath and he was disagreeing with, he was saying you can't even put hot water into a cold bath, and he was disagreeing with Beit Hillel that was allowing that, right? Because Beit Hillel was allowing, in the case of a bath, to put cold water, to add hot water to the cold water bath.
Yeah, it's the next sentence.
Okay? No, Areshakae. He wasn't speaking about the last part of their sentence. He was speaking about the first part. Because there were two cases. The first one was the case of the cup. Okay, and in the case of the cup, Beit Hillel said you can do whatever you want. You can put, if you're dealing with a cup, it's not a pot, it's not something that's ever been over the flame. So you can, if it's cold, you can put some hot into it. If it's hot, you can put some cold into it. But in a bathtub, there, you can put hot into cold. But you can't put cold into hot. And we were assuming that what was Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh saying? You can't even put hot into cold, which would make it impossible to ever moderate or to ever adjust the temperature of a bathtub on Shabbat. Because Rabbi Shimon would be saying that one cannot add cold water to hot, and one cannot add hot water to cold in a bathtub. But rather, he wasn't talking about that case. He was talking about the first case, about the cup. That Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh was saying, just like you can't add cold water to hot water in the bathtub, you can't add cold water into hot water in a cup. But he wasn't saying that you can't add hot water to cold water in a bathtub. As long as what's in the lower part of the mixture, in other words, as long as what's in the cup or what's in the bath that you're starting with is cold, you can add hot. It's just that if what you're starting with is hot, you can't add cold, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh. So therefore, both in a bathtub and in a wash basin, he would say, the solution is, come with cold water first, and then pour hot water into it until the point that it gets warm enough for you to be able to use it comfortably. But don't take hot water and pour cold water into it. That you wouldn't be allowed to do. Now, according to Abaye, you're allowed to do that in a wash basin, and you're allowed to do that in a cup. But according to Rav Yosef, you wouldn't be allowed to add cold water to hot water if the wash basin is full of hot water. Because Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh is saying that even in a cup you can't add cold water into a cup of hot water on Shabbat. Okay, so now the problem is like this. Lema Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh da'amar kebet Shammai? Are you telling me that Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh is agreeing with Beit Shammai? Because you're telling me that Beit Shammai was the one that said that you can't add anything to a cup. Right? You can't add hot to cold, you can't add cold to hot. And now you're saying that that's exactly what Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says. That you can't add cold to hot or hot to cold. He's disagreeing with Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel was saying that you can add cold into hot. I'm sorry, that you can in a cup. You can add cold into hot in a cup. You can add hot to cold in a cup. But that would mean that Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh is disagreeing with Beit Hillel and he's going with Beit Shammai. So what's the answer? He means Hachika Amar Lo Nechleku Bet Shammai uBeit Hillel badavar zeh. What he meant to say was such a machloket never happened. In other words, they never disagreed that one cannot put cold water into hot water when it comes to a cup. Okay? In other words, Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh was not disagreeing with Beit Hillel. He wasn't saying I follow Beit Shammai. He was saying that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel both agree that if you have a hot cup of coffee, you can't add cold water to it. They only allowed you to add hot water to a cold cup. They never allowed you to add cold water to a hot cup. So he wasn't actually disagreeing with Beit Hillel. He was saying, I have the real version of Beit Hillel. You guys have the wrong version of Beit Hillel, and I have the right version. You guys think that Beit Hillel allows you to add cold water to a hot cup. I say that no, they never allowed you to add cold to hot. You can never add cold to hot, not in a bathtub and not in a cup, never. But the Tanakh Kama was reporting Beit Hillel and saying, no, according to Beit Hillel, you can add into a cup, you can add whatever you want, either direction. And only in a bathtub did he say you can't add cold to hot. So in any case, Amar Ravuna B'rei Rabbi Yoshua, Ravuna B'rei Rabbi Yoshua said, Chazina leila Ravad delo kapida mana. We saw that Ravad didn't care in a mana, in a cup. In other words, in a vessel that was never heated over the fire itself, such as a cup of coffee, such as a wash basin. He didn't care whether he was adding cold water to hot or hot water to cold. It didn't matter. Because we have a baraita in the name of Rabbi Chia that says you can take a jug of water and put it into a larger basin of water, whether one is when one is hot and one is cold, and it doesn't matter if the basin you're placing it into has hot water and you're putting your cold jug of water into the hot water, or whether the basin you're putting it into has cold water and you're putting your hot jug of water into the cold, it doesn't matter. You can change the temperature in that way because neither of these items, was over the fire. Since neither one was over the fire, we're not concerned about cooking happening, because cooking can only happen when the vessel involved was heated over the fire. But in Kli Sheni, when we're dealing with an item that was never over the fire itself, such as a mug of coffee, such as a wash basin that you poured from a kettle into the wash basin, so that water, we're not concerned about it cooking anything else, because as Tosafot explained in a couple of places, since the walls are cold, since the vessel itself wasn't heated over the fire, that means the walls are cold. So we look at that water. When you have a mug of coffee, as opposed to a pot of coffee, right? You know that the pot of coffee, as long as it's plugged in, is going to stay hot, hopefully, right? But the mug of coffee, what's happening? Every second it's getting cooler. So certainly it's not going to cook anything else. It's in the process of cooling. So that's why Kli Sheni Eino Mevashel, Tosafot explains. A second vessel, once you pour from that primary vessel into a second vessel, the walls of this cup are not hot like the walls of the pot. So therefore, this coffee is in the process of becoming cooler. It's not going to cook anything else. In fact, if you put something cold in there, it's going to facilitate the process of it becoming cooler rather than cook.
What's kiton?
Kiton is like some kind of jug that they would have. Like you could think of it as a thermos, I guess, that we'd have today. Amar le Ravuna said, le Rav Ashe, Dilma shane hatam de mifsak kli. How can you draw an inference? You're saying that we don't have to care once we're dealing with secondary vessels. And how do we know we don't have to care? Because you see that you can take even a cold jug of water and put it into a hot basin of water. But there's a little bit of a difference there, because in that case they're both sealed. In other words, the jug is sealed. You're not pouring the cold water from the jug into the hot water of the basin. You're just putting a jug which is sealed into the hot water basin. So maybe that's more lenient. And he said to him, no, because Amar le me'arek itmar, because in the actual original version of the statement it said pour, because it said me'are adam kiton shel mayim l'toch sevel shel mayim ben chamin l'toch tonen ben tonen l'toch chamin, because it actually said that you can pour a jug of water into a basin of water. You can pour a hot jug of water into a cold basin of water. You can pour a cold jug of water into a hot basin of water. And since that basin was never over the fire, it was never heated as a Kli Rishon, we're not concerned that it's going to heat up and cook the cold water that you're adding to it, and that's why one is allowed to do that. So there is a problem, for example, an example of this is, let's say you have a cup. Let's say it's Shabbat. Here's a practical example of this. So it's Shabbat, and you want to refill your coffee. Okay, you made some instant coffee or whatever. You want to refill the coffee. The coffee's cold in the cup, right? So now you go over to the urn and you want to refill with some more water and a little more coffee. There's a problem, because now you're pouring directly from a primary vessel into your cold water, because your water became cold again. Okay, or if you had tea or whatever, you're pouring from a hot vessel onto cold water. That you're not allowed to do from the primary vessel into the cold water. If you had already a Kli Sheni, right, you put it in the second vessel and now you pour it to the third, so now you'd be okay. That's what it's saying here. But to pour directly from the primary vessel into the cold water, for sure you wouldn't be allowed to do. And similarly, if you wanted to pour some cold water into the urn, obviously you can't do that.
You wipe out your cup, or you
have to wipe it or get another one.
You get your wife mad and get another cup.
Right. That's the reason. Well, or I mean, if you're a green household and you don't use disposable, then yeah, you can't.
Can you make instant coffee straight from the urn?
Most Kli Sheni for that too.
Yeah.
Rav Moshe said you could do directly, from the urn, because it's already cooked.
Yeah,
the coffee itself's already cooked.
Because we just have a
there's some people are machmir about that. Some people are stringent even on the on coffee. For tea for sure. For tea for sure, you have to do at least a Kli Shlishi. But for coffee, there's difference of opinion. So Rav Moshe, when I was growing up,
roasted over fire.
Yeah, Rav Moshe Feinstein said that you can actually. Rav Moshe Feinstein said, and especially the instant. Even if you want to, right, the instant, because instant is cooked.
Been cooked,
right?
Just dried out.
Yeah, for Sfaradim, you could do it even over coffee beans, because we say that any type of bishul is ein bishul achar bishul. That's a whole other issue. But but when I was growing up, the rabbi used to make instant coffee directly from the urn. But then later on, people started becoming more machmir about it because there were other opinions. But when I was growing up, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zichrono Livracha, he had said that it was fine, and people followed that basically. And Rav Ovadia also says that too. That's pretty accepted. But there are people who are machmir about that. Now, the new Mishnah, if you take your pot off of the fire, so you have a pot stewing over the fire, you take it off the fire, it's still called kli rishon. It's still called a primary vessel. It doesn't lose its status, because what's the definition of a primary vessel? Not the vessel that's on the fire, but a vessel that was on the fire, that the pot was heated. Okay, that's what distinguishes the kli rishon from the kli sheni. In a kli sheni, for example, once you pour from your pot, you have a pot of stew or something, or chili, whatever it is, you pour it into a serving container. So that serving container was never over the fire. The actual serving vessel is not hot, except from the food maybe that you put on it, but it's not hot itself. So that's why it's a kli sheni, because it was never over the fire. So when you take your pot off, and the ilfas and kedera are just different types of pots, you take them off of the flame. So lo yiten letochan tivalin, you still cannot put in there any spices, because it's still considered cooking. It's a first vessel. As we turn to Amud Bet, aval hu notenu letocha ka'ara or letocha tamchoy. So if you want to add salt to your food, don't add it to the pot. Let's say you take cholent or dafina or whatever you're taking off pot. Don't add it into the pot, the salt or the on Shabbat. On Shabbat you can't do that. Even once you've taken it off, it's still a kli rishon. It's still a primary vessel, but add it in the bowl. So if you want to add some spices to your soup, take your soup into your bowl and put the salt into the bowl. Don't add anything on the pot that was over the fire, because the pot itself is still a kli rishon. These are two. A kara is like a personal plate. A tamchoy is like a serving platter. Rabbi Yehuda Omer lakolo noten chutz midavar shesh bo chometz v'tzir. Now we're going to see again. This is an ambiguous statement of Rabbi Yehuda. We're not exactly sure what he's commenting on. He says you can put spices into anything unless the item has chometz, vinegar, or tzir, brine, these are two very acidic sorts of ingredients that will make the spices cook faster. So we're going to see what case is he talking about. Okay, is he being stringent or is he being lenient? So Ibai, who they asked a question, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda which case is Rabbi Yehuda talking about? Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says a comment that we don't know which statement to apply it to. So is he talking about the first part and he's being lenient? In other words, he's saying, you know what? You can put salt or you can put spices. Let's not use salt because we're going to see they're going to bring up salt in a second. Any spice, you can put, what's another spice? Cumin or something into the pot. Okay, chili powder into the pot. But as long as the pot doesn't have vinegar or brine. In other words, he's being very lenient. He's saying you could put whatever spices you want even into the original vessel that was over the pot that was over the flame that you took off of the flame. You can put any spices you want as long as your dish that you're making in that pot doesn't have vinegar and it doesn't have brine. Or is he talking about the latter part of the Mishnah? The latter part of the Mishnah was the lenient part that was saying once it's on your plate, you can add whatever spices you want. And along comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, actually, if it has brine or it has vinegar, you can't. Even on your plate, add certain things. Okay, this was another question, a famous question about, can you put ketchup? If you take cholent or dafina, can you put ketchup on the plate and mix it on the plate? Or is it considered that was an issue? So
if you have kids, it better be yes.
It better be yes. Well, the question was because since it's a solid and the Ashkenazim are machmir, and they say even in a kli sheni, if it's very thick, it could still be considered like a kli rishon. Remember from your idea. So, anyway, it was an issue, but it turned out to be okay. That's another famous tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein too. Tashma, come and listen. The Tanya in a bright that says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer lechol ilfasin hu noten lechol kederot rotchot hu noten. He was talking about the first part of the Mishnah. He was being lenient. He was saying you can even in a boiling pot, as long as you took it off the fire, you can put spices in. However, chutz midavar sheish bo chometz v'tzir, as long as it doesn't have vinegar or brine that is going to. So since it's not over the fire, in other words, Rabbi Yehuda is being lenient here. Normally, we don't distinguish between a pot that's currently over the fire and a pot that was over the fire, as long as it's still hot and it was over the fire, we treat it the same. Rabbi Yehuda is coming along and saying once you take it off the flame, it no longer cooks as readily, and therefore unless there's something in the ingredients that's going to facilitate the cooking of these spices, it's okay to put them in once you've taken the pot off the flame. Everybody would agree, of course, when it's over the flame, that's just straight cooking, and you definitely can't do that on Shabbat. Now, the Gemara goes on, Savar Rav Yosef thought that salt should be just like other spices. That you can add it, you can't add it to a first vessel. In other words, the vessel that came right off the stove, you cannot add salt to it. But once it's in the second vessel, you can. Amar le Abaye, Abaye said, Tane Rabbi Chia taught, Melach ena kitvalin. Salt is not like spices. You can't even put it in a second vessel. Now this would make for very difficult Shabbat meals, because that, according to this, you can't even put salt on something on your plate. If somebody serves you, let's say, soup from the pot, and they put it in your bowl, according to this, you wouldn't even be allowed to add salt to the second vessel, because salt, according to this, cooks very readily, because it absorbs immediately. It disappears. If the salt stayed caked in your soup, it wouldn't be good. It dissolves immediately, so it's like a type of cooking, cooks very quickly. That's what Abaye said. So now they said to him, "Upligad Rav Nachman." This would be a contradiction to Rav Nachman. Amar Rav Nachman, "Tzricha milcha bishula kebisrat Torah." That actually it's the opposite. Salt is so resistant to cooking, that actually it needs as much cooking as the meat of an ox, which needs to be over the flame to cook. You can't cook it in a bowl. You need to be over the flame. So what Rav Nachman was saying was, in other words, it depends on how you look at it. On one hand, we can look at salt as something. It depends how we're looking at salt. If we're looking at salt because it absorbs very quickly, it dissolves very quickly, if we look at that as the bishul of salt, then we can understand why they would consider salt to cook very readily, because it absorbs and it dissolves right away. But if we look at salt in and of itself as a separate entity, cooking salt, I don't even know what that would mean. It's a rock. So you're cooking just the mineral itself. So the question is, do we look at salt in the context of cooking in its culinary framework, and we know that when you put it into the food it absorbs right away? Or do we look at it in and of itself and say, what would it take to cook salt by itself? In which case we would have a much stricter view. So now we have another version of this discussion. Vikad Amrei Savar Rav Yosef lememar harehu kitavlin melach harehu kitvalin debechli rishon bashla bekli sheni lo bashla amar le Abaye tanei Rabbi Chia melach ena kitvalin debechli rishon nami lo bashla. The opposite. In other words, that Rav Yosef thought that salt should just be like other foods, other spices, and you shouldn't be allowed to add them to a primary vessel, but you should be allowed to add them to a secondary vessel. And Abaye came along and said that, you know what Rabbi Chia said? Even to a primary vessel you can add them. In other words, once you've taken it off the flame, you can add salt even to the pot that's over the fire, that was over the fire rather. Okay, so you turned off the flame, let's say, and you left the soup sitting on the stove with the flame off. Okay, before Shabbat started, it's just sitting there, there's no flame. So that's a Kli Rishon still, if it's still hot. So he's saying you could put salt into it.
So then you went and tasted it before you gave it.
And you said, no, it needs some salt. Right. So Rabbi Chia is saying that's okay. And it says, because salt needs the amount of cooking of the meat of an ox. In other words, because we don't look at the fact that the salt dissolves in the mixture as a sign that it cooks quickly, but we look at salt in and of itself. Now, we know that in a chemical reaction, the salt is binding with other things in there and it's dissolving. But when we look at it in and of itself, the salt is not being cooked quickly. The salt is a mineral, so it actually is not easily softened by the fire. And so that's how we define its cooking standard. And therefore, we say that unless the flame is on, you can't. You can put salt in. So that's why, according to the latter version, which is the version that has the aleph because it goes to the Shulchan Aruch, that's what is brought in the Shulchan Aruch. That once you've turned the flame off, salt, no other spices, but salt you can put into this Kli Rishon once you turn the flame off.
Only according to the Maran.
Right, according to the Shulchan Aruch. Yeah, only according to the Shulchan Aruch.
But if the salt is within the liquid, it dissolves.
Yeah, it dissolves, but it's not considered cooking. It's just dissolving. You can dissolve water. If you take cold water, you put salt, also dissolve. Have you ever made salt water? Yeah, that's it works. It works there too. So, next Mishnah. Let's say you have a candle, an oil candle, and you're afraid it might leak. So you decide on Shabbat, you take a plate and you put it next to the candle so that it leaks onto the plate. Okay, rather than leaking onto your table or whatever it might be. But if you put it before Shabbat, it's okay. And whatever the case may be, even if you put a dish next to your candle so that it drips onto the candle. Onto the dish rather than onto the table. You can't take that oil on Shabbat. Say, oh, I caught some oil that dripped off the candle. I'll take it and I'll put it on my bread. You can't do that. Because it wasn't mina mukhan, it's muktzeh. Anything you put into a candle on Shabbat, you're saying, I don't want it. Muktzeh means you can't handle it, you can't touch it, because you designated it for a non-Shabbat use. By putting oil into the candle, you are saying, I don't want to handle this oil on Shabbat, because you're putting it in a candle. How much more could you push away the oil than that? So the fact that some of it drips now onto your plate doesn't mean that all of a sudden you can use it for Shabbat. So you have to leave it on the plate. Now, most people, they put something under their candles to catch, the dripping wax or the dripping oil before Shabbat anyway. But that's the idea. You can't do it on Shabbat. If you can't put a plate there to catch the oil. And the Gemara is going to struggle with what the reason is for this prohibition. What's the problem? What's wrong with putting a plate next to a candle to catch oil? As long as you don't use the oil, what's the problem? So, the Amar Rav Chisda says, "Af bishamrei notnin kli tachat tarnagolet lekabel betzata, aval kofeh alei kli shelo tishaver." That an unrelated halacha is brought up first. That even though the rabbi said you can't put a kli, you can't put a vessel under the chicken to catch the egg that it lays on Shabbat. So you know that your chicken is about to lay an egg, and it's Shabbat. You can't put a vessel under it to catch it out of fear that it might roll and be broken. Because you'll say, oh, is going to lay this egg in a place that's a precarious place, and then it's going to roll, it's going to break. You can't do that. However, you can take a vessel and you can put it over the egg. So you can't catch the egg, but you can cover the egg. If once the egg is laid, you can go and put something over the egg so nobody steps on it, or whatever. But if the egg is coming out, you can't take something and put it under the chicken to catch the egg. We'll see why this is.
Can you catch it in midair? If it has
in your hand? No. You can't touch it because it's nolad. So the egg itself is muktzeh because it's a new thing. It's called nolad. Anything that wasn't there before Shabbat, you can't handle it. So the question here, as we're going to see, there's going to be a machloket about what is the reason for this halacha, and that's going to impact it's the same idea of putting a vessel under your candle to catch the oil, putting a vessel under your chicken to catch the egg. Okay, yeah. So the same thing you're not allowed to do. So now we're going to apply whatever the principle is in case B to case A. So Amar Rabba says, "My tamad Rav Chisda." What is Rav Chisda's reasoning that you can't put a vessel under a chicken? So he says, because he says a tarnagolet, a chicken, will lay an egg in a dump. In other words, it'll lay it in a place that's not appropriate, that people might trample the egg. But it will not lay an egg in a precarious place. In other words, in a place that's on an incline, so that it's going to roll and break. It won't do that. And the rabbis permitted hatzalam mitzuya. In other words, something which is a common case, the rabbis permitted. And it's a common case that the chicken might lay an egg in a place where others might trample it. Because a chicken can't think about that. Chickens don't say, well, if I lay the egg here, somebody might come and step on it. They're not thinking. But a chicken won't squat to lay an egg on an incline where it's going to roll. Because even a chicken can tell that that's not a good idea. Okay, it doesn't need to think ahead. It doesn't need to anticipate future events in order to realize that that's not a good idea, let's say. So the chicken will do that. So that's why you're allowed to cover over the egg, because that's expected, that the chicken might lay the egg and it might not be the most convenient place and someone's going to step on it. But you can't catch the egg because it's unlikely anyway that you'll need to, because most likely the chicken will lay it in a place that it's going to sit and be stable. Now, what's the relevance here? So Rashi explains that according to this interpretation of Rav Chisda, the prohibition is we know that one can't handle something that's muktzeh on Shabbat. But that Rav Chisda is going a step further and saying you can't handle something for something muktzeh either. If the reason you're moving this cup is to catch something muktzeh, If the reason that you're moving this cup is to cover something muktzeh, it's also an extension of the prohibition of muktzeh. You can't do it. But the rabbis permitted it in common situations of problems. They allowed you to move a non-muktzeh item, an item that you'd normally be allowed to move, even though you're moving it for the sake of protecting or preserving something that you're not allowed to handle. Okay? They allowed it in common cases. So Abaye is going to bring a whole series of problems. Maybe in a way, yeah. So Abaye raised an objection. Is it really true that in an unusual case the rabbis didn't allow you to move, let's say, a vessel that's permitted for the sake of a vessel that's not? Is that true? Let's say you had a barrel of tevel. Tevel is untithed produce. Untithed produce is muktzeh because you can't eat it and you can't use it. And so the fact that you didn't tithe it before Shabbat meant you weren't planning on using it for Shabbat. It's excluded from your mind and there's no way to fix it on Shabbat. So it's muktzeh, you can't touch it. Alright, so now what happens? So one of these barrels, now you were planning on tithing it after Shabbat or at some future time. Of course, you don't want it to be lost. So one of the barrels of untithed produce breaks on Shabbat, it's on the roof. And you can run with another vessel and put it underneath so it catches the oil or the wine or the grain or whatever is spilling out of this barrel. Okay? Even though you couldn't touch the grain itself or the oil itself or the wine itself because it's muktzeh and it hasn't been tithed, you can put a vessel under it to catch it. Now what does that show you? You're moving a vessel, like let's say a bowl, a basin or whatever, for the sake of this item that's not allowed to be handled. And you're not going to handle the item directly, but you're actually moving a bowl to catch it. So how can you do that? So the answer is we're talking about new earthenware jugs that frequently, when they were new, there was a high likelihood that they would break, they would crack. Okay, only the well-used ones and the veteran ones were really considered reliable. But ones that were new, they would very typically crack, and therefore it wasn't considered unusual to have to do that. Another objection. It says that you're allowed to put a vessel next to your candle to catch sparks. You don't want a fire to start, right? So you want to put something down. Many people put tinfoil or something around their candles, for example, so that if there's a spark, it won't hit the table, it won't hit wood. So similarly, it says you're allowed to put a plate to catch sparks. So why should you be allowed to do that? You're moving that vessel. Can you touch a spark on Shabbat? You're allowed to handle sparks? No. So how can you move a vessel to catch a spark? You're moving a vessel for the spark. So the answer, and you told me that only something common is allowed. I wouldn't say that's common, that sparks are flying out of your candle. So he says, no. That's considered a common enough occurrence because people actually anticipate that happening, and they do take that precaution. So now we go to Mem Gimel Amud Aleph just to finish the objections here. Another objection. Again, it said that you can take a vessel and put it over a lamp if you're afraid that the flame is going to flare up and cause the roof to catch on fire. So again, what are you moving that vessel for? You're moving that vessel to go over the candle. So you're doing it for the candle, you're doing it for the lamp, and yet you're allowed to move a vessel for the lamp. And it's not a common case. How common is it that a flame is going to cause the roof to catch on fire? Not very common, one would think. But the Gemara says again, it says, we're talking about very low roofed houses. Houses that have a very low roof, it is common. So since it's common, it's allowed. And then, again, we have another case that if there's a broken board in your roof, you can take a bench or a part of the bed, and you can take the bed frame and you can turn it vertically and hold the roof, hold that beam in place so that it doesn't fall. Now, is the beam of the roof allowed to be handled on Shabbat? No, it's part of a building. How could you handle it on Shabbat? But again, since it's something, in other words, the principle here being that one can move a permitted item, such as the bench, in order to serve a non-permitted item, in order to support or to serve or somehow to indirectly deal with a non-handleable item on Shabbat. Only in a case where it's a common occurrence that you would need to do that. And it's considered common because this was a new roof. And new roofs, again, unlike today where we would probably assume that a new roof is more reliable. Back then a new roof was more of a question because it was untested. And they didn't have the kind of maybe precision engineering that we have. So that it was considered more of an untested thing. So you would need to do that. And finally, notnin kli tachat delef b'Shabbat. Again, it says that what if there's a leak in the roof on Shabbat and the water's coming down? Okay, right? So what do you do then? So you can put a vessel to catch the rain that's dripping down from the roof. Even though is the rain dripping down from the roof, it's also muktzeh because you didn't have it before Shabbat.
That one we have very common here.
That's common around here. That's true, lately especially. Yeah. So what do you do then? So again, it said with roofs that commonly leak, it's considered a common occurrence. So the principle is defended, basically, that so far, what Rabbah has said, interpreting this halacha, why can you not put a vessel under the chicken to catch the egg, but you can cover the egg with a vessel if he lays it somewhere, or she lays it somewhere that is not ideal? The reason is because that case is common, that the chicken will lay an egg in a place that others might trample it. And since it's common, you can move an item that's not muktzeh for the sake of that muktzeh item. And then all of these other cases are cases where it's commonly expected that this muktzeh item will start to break, or will come apart, or will need to be saved. And therefore, since it's commonly expected that that's the case, one is allowed to move a non-muktzeh vessel in order to prevent further damage or prevent further loss of the muktzeh entity, or whether it be the beam in the roof, whether it is the untithed produce, or whatever, or whether it be that to protect one's house from the rain falling in, whatever it may be. So we're going to see that tomorrow that Rav Yosef has a totally different theory of what the reason for this halacha is. Now, how would Rabbah explain our case? He would say that, you can't put a vessel under the candle to catch oil on Shabbat. Why not? Because it's not common that a candle leaks oil. It's not common that a candle leaks oil. That would be an uncommon occurrence, and that's why he would say you wouldn't be allowed to do it. So that's how he's going to explain our Mishnah. Rav Yosef is going to come with a different reason for why you can't put the vessel under the chicken to catch the egg, and he's going to defend himself against a whole bunch of other objections, and then say that that's the reason why you can't put the plate under the vessel under the candle to catch the oil on Shabbat. So we're going to see these two competing theories to explain this halakha. We'll see theory number 2 tomorrow. Have a